So I need you to put your hands together, to bring the house down, and to welcome the man, Rory Sutherland.
Thank you. Oh, what a joy. I'm not actually that good. I don't think anything I could deliver here, short of taking my clothes off or something, could possibly live up to that introduction. But I've called this innovation. Can I just also say that you didn't have to persuade me to come, because I wanted to go to Montenegro for years and years and years. I had a friend who visited some years ago who always recommended it as the greatest place, and he was right. And the second thing, it's been worth my coming anyway, just to sit in the audience for about 3 hours today. I thought Asa's talk this morning, I thought Ancilla's talk just previously were both really fascinating, because although what I'm talking about today is about really the positive side of advertising and marketing, because that's my job, okay? Both Asa and Ancilla, I think, have talked about something that's been worrying me more and more for the last few years. So I'm just going to start off with just a few minutes of echoing negative fears that I have. So for example, on the 10th floor of this building, and actually on the hotel next door, there's a casino, okay? Now, I imagine, statistically, about 2 or 3 people in the audience, maybe more, are gambling addicts or recovering gambling addicts. Now, the best advice I can give you if you're a recovering gambling addict is don't go to casinos, okay? If you can actually manage to obey that rule, then the problem of not gambling becomes a lot easier. The human brain has very, very strong associations. If you are a former heroin addict, for instance, you're told the first rule of giving up heroin is that street where you used to go to buy your heroin, you can't even drive within 3 blocks of that street for the rest of your life. That's the extent to which association can drive falling back with addiction. And what's been worrying me a little bit in the advertising industry is that if you imagine in an advertising agency that 5 people are seated around a table and you have a brief to sell an alcoholic drink, or you have a brief to sell an online gambling site, and somebody in the room says, I've got a great idea, why don't we put posters up for booze at meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Now, I'll be absolutely honest with you, a few people will laugh, people will go, good idea, but I can also guarantee something else, nobody will ever do that. A, because it's disgusting, even if, to be honest, they don't think it's disgusting, they know that the reputational risk is too high. Similarly, going to meetings of Gamblers Anonymous and putting up ads for mobile phone gambling apps, not going to happen in the real human world. But an algorithm's going to discover that without even knowing what it's doing. Algorithms are going to find out what people's weak spots are, and they're going to follow them around. Now, as I said, in the physical world, where you were controlled what you could do, there were very simple strategies. If you wanted to give up drink, don't go to pubs. If you want to give up gambling, don't go to casinos. In the digital world, there's no escape from temptation. So, whereas someone who is trying to give up gambling could not read the sports pages of the newspaper, not go to bookmakers, not go to casinos, in the digital world, ads for those things might follow them around absolutely anywhere they go, divorced from any context. And algorithms don't have an ethical sense. They're probably programmed simply to maximize returns. My guess would be that winning back a recovering gambling addict shows extraordinarily positive financial returns, as would discovering people who have a propensity to become addicts in the first place. And we can be hacked. Loads and loads of evidence from nature suggests that things evolve to hack us. Diseases, for example, viruses, evolve the capacity, first of all, to hack us, and then to fight our immunity. And what happens when you have high-speed A/B testing taking place at an industrial scale is the same thing that's always happened will be going on, but it'll be going on at a much, much faster speed. And if that is, I think we have to acknowledge that it's potentially very scary indeed. So I'm starting off being negative. I'm going to follow up now with something which I think is optimistic. I call this innovation because it's a form of, it's not a misspelling, it's a form of invention which relies much more on understanding the properties of the human brain and human perception rather than understanding the laws of physics. So innovators, as opposed to innovators, are less interested in the properties of silicon and more interested in the properties of neurons. The reason I'm excited by this is twofold. I've worked in an advertising agency for about 30 years. I've always had the feeling that there are hundreds of problems out there that we could help solve that we're never asked to solve. And the reason is largely, there are several reasons, but one of them is historical. It's simply the fact that traditionally advertising agencies were paid commission by media owners. So people who have problems that didn't involve bought media tended not to talk to advertising agencies. We haven't been paid that way for 25 years. We still behave as though that's how we're paid. There's absolutely no reason for a solution that depends on human insight and that depends on human insight and creativity. There's no need, particularly in the digital age, but there's no need for that to involve bought media at all. And there are hundreds of solutions you can find out there that have an extraordinary effect, which may simply be achieved with a tiny little bit of human insight and a change in a single word. I'll give you one example. More than doubling the effectiveness of a call center by adding a single phrase into a call center script. The simple phrase was, most people do this. If you offer people 3 choices, and then you also flag the choice that's most popular, it makes it much easier for people to choose. Because the human instinct is very heavily driven towards herd behavior and social decision making. And when we have to communicate not knowing what's more popular, we feel like we're deciding blind. It's vitally important, I think, and we've totally failed to understand this in selling financial services products. When you buy a financial services product, such as a pension, the usual heuristics we use when we buy a car, what car did my dad have? What car do people like me have? What's the best-selling car out there? What car did I buy last time? Habit. All of those heuristics that we use to reassure ourselves in decision-making are completely absent. And when you have those conditions, making a decision is really, really difficult. And there is a really important thing here, even if you think marketing's evil, which is if you make making a decision really difficult, people do 2 things. They either decide really badly, or they don't do anything at all. So whatever marketing does, to some extent, at least you're improving on really appalling decisions or total inertia. You know, there are people who should have had pensions 15 years ago, and the reason they don't have a pension isn't because that's a bad idea, it's because no one ever presented them with a choice they could make. I'll give you a very simple story which is worth knowing how wrong economics is about human psychology. Imagine you have 2 products and they're on the shelf. One of them is ostensibly better than the other. It has more features. It's smaller if small's good, or bigger if big's good. It has more of the things you want. But it's cheaper. Now, to an economist, to a rationalist, that's the easiest decision you've ever got to make. More features, lower price. What actually happens in the market in the real world is people get confused. They go, that doesn't really make sense, because if that thing were really better, they'd be charging more for it. It's metacognition, if you like. There must be something wrong here. That product, although it seems better, if it's cheaper, that must mean it's shit in some dimension I don't currently understand. So what happens when people are presented with that isn't that they choose the cheaper, better one, it's that they don't buy either of them. because they can't make sense of the choice. Those of you who remember low-cost airlines always made a really big deal about what you didn't get. Do you remember that? You don't get a checked-in luggage, you don't get a meal, you don't get a pre-allocated seat, all of those things you didn't get. Now that sounds a really strange thing to do. Why would you tell people the downside to your airline? And the reason was, it was to make the low price believable. If you'd gone around saying, we're just as good as Lufthansa, but we're half the price, the consumer does not react with, oh, that's great then, fantastic, I'll go with you. They go, no, that doesn't make sense. If you're that much cheaper than Lufthansa, it probably means that there's something about you I don't know that makes you cheap. Maybe you don't service the engines on the plane, or your pilots are all on day release from prison, or something like that. Okay? So marketing is much more complicated than people realize. It's not only about justifying a higher price, it may be about destigmatizing a lower price. Now, that's my first reason I'm excited. The second reason I'm excited is I agree with Google about their whole idea of 10x. Part of Alphabet is a thing called Google X. Astro Teller is he's actually the grandson of the man who developed the H-bomb, a man called Edward Teller. So he has some family experience in developing significant innovations. But the point there is that they say that too much effort in society is dedicated to looking at incremental improvements, things that are 5% better, 3% better, 8% better. And to really make a difference in the world, you've got to look for something that's 10 times, an order of magnitude better. And they're kind of right. I don't think it makes that huge a difference if something is 3% cheaper, if a train is 5% faster. I don't think those things are game changers in the way humans think, act, and behave. Where I disagree with Google slightly is that Google are engineers, not psychologists. And my argument is that in 2017, making something 10 times faster, for example, you run up against the laws of physics. It's very difficult to make a train go at 1,000 miles an hour. In most things, in terms of the physical universe, there may be a few exceptions. Their definition of the Google driverless car, by the way, is that it's a 10x project because they want to reduce the number of road fatalities by 90%. That's why they call it a 10x thing. But in many, many areas of human life, we hit the laws of what is actually possible. We hit the laws of diminishing returns. I would argue, however, in psychology, I would say that most R&D put into 10x projects should be looking for things that feel 10 times different rather than are 10 times different. It's very, very hard to make an aeroplane 10 times faster than the 787. But you can make a hotel 10 times cooler than another hotel at a fraction of the price, and it's much, much easier. Making a train journey 10 times more enjoyable might be a far more worthwhile aim than making the train journey 90% shorter in duration. By the way, if you want to make a train journey 10 times shorter, but you're happy to use human psychology, it's called a sleeper train. The journey may take 9 hours, but you're asleep for 8 of them. There is no aircraft that's as fast as a sleeper train, in many respects. So where I think they're wrong is that too much engineering technological genius is looking for things that are 10 times different, whereas what matters to humans is things that feel 10 times different. Now, if you think this sounds really weird, it's already happened in nature. This should be the official plant of the advertising and marketing discipline. It's a chili, okay? You probably thought it was a paprika from this part of the world, didn't you? It's actually a chili. Like the paprika, I'm fairly sure, it contains a thing called capsaicin. The interesting thing about capsaicin is it isn't hot. It doesn't hurt you, okay? You know that feeling when you eat something very, very hot, whether it's a curry or something really, really spicy, you're thinking, this must be really, my lips are stinging, my mouth is burning, this must be really, really hurting my skin. Do you know the truth of the matter is? Not actually doing anything. What capsaicin does, it doesn't tinker with reality. It was very difficult. If nature had tried to do a Google 10x saying we want to make a plant that's genuinely really hot, That would have been a really difficult thing to do. Okay? You'd have to maintain an insane temperature at all times. Not easy to do. The way capsaicin works is it messes with our sensory receptors in our mouth and skin and makes them hypersensitive and makes them detect heat when there's actually none there. So the chili is a fantastic thing that is apparently, we all think of it as a hot thing to add to food. Doesn't change the actual heat, acidity, anything like that of the food. It just changes the way we taste it by messing with our perception. Now, this is a point from an Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises. The interesting thing about the Austrian School of Economics is they accepted that value is entirely subjective. And therefore, you can create value just as much through changing perception as changing reality. In this quote from On Human Action, von Mises actually means here, by the man who sweeps the floor, he explicitly means marketing and advertising. Sounds a bit weird. The point is that your ability to enjoy a meal isn't just dependent on what the meal is. It depends on the context in which it's served to you. If you were served a Michelin-starred meal in a restaurant that smelled slightly of sewage, you wouldn't enjoy the food at all. Okay? The idea that we value things objectively, free of the context and expectation which we bring to them, is completely wrong. Therefore, there are two ways of making that restaurant better. The restaurant that serves fantastic food that smells of sewage. One of them is to make the food even better. The other way is to get rid of the smell. Now, an awful lot of the time, because people think it's the objective thing that matters, we must make the food even better so it's the best food in town, they neglect the context in which things are presented. Now, how many people here use TripAdvisor? The truth of the matter is, okay, that your enjoyment of a restaurant is very much dependent on a whole host of reasons which are almost nothing to do with the restaurant. Okay? Secondly, if we're in a bad mood in a restaurant, we decide that it's a bad restaurant and we invent reasons why it's not very good, even if it wasn't the restaurant that put us in a bad mood. This is called emotional misattribution. Nearly everything that humans experience emotionally, they come up with rational reasons for, but the rational reasons are entirely post-rationalized. So I'll give you an example. If you go and look for really, really negative reviews of restaurants on TripAdvisor, it's amazing to see how many of them start with the words, "We had booked a restaurant for my mother-in-law's birthday." Okay. What that really means is the person didn't really want to go out for a meal anyway. Because it's his mother-in-law's birthday, they've got to go to a much fancier restaurant than the restaurant they really wanted to go to. Because it's her birthday, he knows he's going to end up paying. He wanted to stay at home and watch Champions League. Then, before he gets to the restaurant, he has a bit of difficulty parking. Now he's in a really bad mood, and it's almost impossible for the restaurant not to be a shit restaurant. Because he's in a bad mood, he's in a restaurant, therefore he hates it. And he'll just look for any evidence to corroborate the fact that the restaurant's bad. This business where, by the way, we have a first impression or we have a first emotional state, and it affects everything we do because we just look for confirmation bias. We saw a wonderful data set from a hotel in Memphis. And it measured what people thought of various things in the hotel, including a pretty irrelevant thing, which was an ice sculpture in the garden. They had a massive, great ice sculpture in the garden during winter. Virtually every perception of the hotel depended on what your check-in experience was like. If you had a good, quick check-in, everything about the hotel was good. Not just things that are relevant, like the quality of service, because you could argue that check-in is part of service. If people had had a quick experience on check-in, they thought the ice sculpture was brilliant. If they'd had to wait 20 minutes to check in behind a United Airlines flight crew, they thought the ice sculpture was shit. Okay? So the idea that we have this objective measure of things that's free of context, just forget about it. Everything we judge is based on our prior expectation to us, what we compare it to, what we've experienced before, The idea that there's just this thing called utility, which is produced in a factory and is completely dissociated from the context in which the thing is consumed, not happening. Now, just to prove this, we can all think of cases where not brilliant products, and I'll show you a few examples, not brilliant products have been marketed fantastically so that people love them. What I always wanted to find was a case where a fabulous product was marketed terribly. Now, how many of you have heard of Ed Sheeran here? Okay, good, right. So he's been #1 in the UK for about 10 weeks. He's probably, in a weird kind of way, one of the most successful musicians, most popular musicians in the world. And what would it take to get somebody to market an Ed Sheeran concert, not just an Ed Sheeran concert, but a personal one-to-one Ed Sheeran concert in a really terrible way? This is just to prove that it doesn't matter how good your product is if your marketing is terrible. Now, who's going to do that? Well, the answer is 2 Australian comedians. This is what they did. Go.
Hello.
Hi.
Whee!
Peep shows. They have a pretty bad name. Normally associated with lewd content, but by definition, they don't have to be.
So in an attempt to change that, we took one of the world's biggest performing artists, kept all his clothes on, and set up an Ed Sheeran peep show. Would anyone dare to believe what was written outside and come into our very dodgy looking venue?
How are you feeling? I don't really know what's going on, to be honest.
That was fair enough, because we dressed Hamish as a fairly shady-looking spruiker in charge of getting customers.
I got you Sheeran. Who wants some Sheeran?
All right, I can hear Hamish.
Do you think we'll get anyone?
I don't think we'll get anyone. It's going to be a brave soul.
I wouldn't come into... If there was a dude with a beard with a hat saying, like, come in and see this.
Ed was right. This was going to be tough.
You want to peep at Ed Sheeran for $2? Insurance. Do you want to peep at Ed Sheeran? Your loss. What do you reckon, big fella? Got Ed Sheeran in here. Beautiful ginger head man. Sitting on a stool. What do you reckon? $2. Got Ed Sheeran just sitting on a stool in there. You want him? $2. $2 for a peep. Think about it. It's actually pretty good value.
Despite trying, we'd had a total lack of interest for over 50 minutes. It's been some time. We should have got you a more comfy chair, I think.
Yeah, I'm all right.
Hey, big fella, got all the Sheeran you need in there. $2.
What is it?
All the Ed Sheeran you need.
What the what?
Ed Sheeran.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
He's a singer. Yeah? Is that a yes? No? I think one of the big problems is people think Ed Sheeran's a code word for a new drug. How's it going? You guys like Ed Sheeran? $2. $2 for a 30-second peep.
What, like, are they just saying no?
Yeah.
Category.
Dirt sheet peep. Dirt sheet peep. Here we go, $2.
Do you reckon we're pricing it too high, and that's why we're not getting people coming in?
I think $2 is pretty fair.
Here we go, boys. It's a Friday. Get you Ed Sheeran peep show. $2. Sitting on a stool, play you a song.
If someone actually does think it's a peep show, I might quickly give you the go-ahead to take off all your clothes. Are you willing to do that?
I've been drinking a lot of beer recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You're not?
A couple of months ago, maybe, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm in shape. It's just the shape of a potato.
2 hours in, and Hamish was getting more desperate.
Ed Sheeran is literally sitting in there on the stage waiting for your $2.
We were feeling it as well, but just when we thought this had been a giant waste of everyone's time.
You guys like Ed Sheeran?
I love him.
You love Ed Sheeran? $2? Peep show. Just got him sitting on stage in there.
Nah, you're lying.
Oh, $2. It's gonna cost you $2. You only get 30 seconds though. You wanna come in?
I don't believe you.
Well, there's only one way to find out.
We might be on here.
Here we go. Ed Sheeran peep show. He's there till midday. All right, your choice.
No, she did the smart thing and walked away.
Listen, if you guys want, I'm just saying, if you guys want to have a go, he's sitting in there by himself. It'll probably get busy later on. $2, 30 seconds. I mean, you both can come if you want. Just $2 a head. Everything's above board, I can assure you.
I'm not gonna get
Nah, absolutely not. Like, I can't guarantee what Ed'll do, but yeah, let's pay you $2.
And after 2 hours and 23 minutes, including some final hesitation, we finally found people brave enough to take a peek.
Did you guys go to peep shows a lot, or?
There's some kind of...
There you go, man. Keep your clothes on, stay on the seat, behave yourselves.
No.
Just listen to the announcement. Have a good one. Enjoy your peep.
Hello and welcome to the Peep Show. Your time will start In 5 seconds.
I'm actually a bit scared. Oh, it's
Darling, I will be loving you till we're 70. Baby, my heart can still fall as hard at 23. And I'm thinking about how people fall in love.
Your time is finished. Thank you very much, Pete.
Now, interestingly, first rule, if you haven't got trust, doesn't matter what you've got to sell. You can't sell it. So if you use all those low trust kind of indicators, what did get them in, if you notice the two people who went in, are known properties of behavioral science. It's going to get pretty busy later on. Remember that? When you book on an airline website, remember only 4 seats left at this price. Create a bit of scarcity. You only get 30 seconds. So actually giving a reason, it's only 30 seconds, but also you can both come in. We're a herd species. Doing something strange feels much more comfortable if you can do it with someone you know. Now that sounds a trivial finding. It also helps in getting vaccination against unpleasant diseases in the developing world. If you want mums to vaccinate their children, they've discovered this, don't have one nurse, have 2 nurses, and allow mothers to come with a friend, with the friend's child, and both children are vaccinated simultaneously. You get much bigger take-up than if you make people do it one at a time. But notice that again, it's what is it? It's going to get pretty busy. He's only here until 12 o'clock. Scarcity value, known absolute behavioral technique. The second really important thing to know before you get obsessed with objectivity, which is what is our product like objectively, is that we don't perceive the world objectively. If you want the simple reason for this, evolution doesn't give a shit about accuracy. It only cares about fitness. If evolution has to make a decision between, do I sacrifice a bit of objectivity and gain a bit of fitness, or do I sacrifice a bit of fitness and gain a bit of accuracy, it's going to go with fitness every time. We haven't evolved to see the world as it really is, because seeing the world as it really is doesn't help our survival or reproductive fitness. We have to notice faces much more than we notice other shapes. We have to notice movement much more than things that stay still. We have to notice contrast much more than absolute values. But furthermore, we think we can separate what we see from what we hear, from what we smell, from what we taste. We think that all our senses are independent. But again, what evolution needs isn't an accurate depiction of what all your senses are doing. It needs a non-ambiguous depiction of reality that enables you to make a decision. And it will distort reality as much as it needs to in order to give you an advantage. Have a look at this.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba. Ba,
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
ba,
Take another look.
ba,
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
ba,
Now to the left of the screen.
ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear.
you see what I mean by that? That actually, what evolution needs, we have, this is a beautiful phrase by George Lowenstein, the behavioral economist, just as we have a sex drive and a food drive, we have a sense-making drive. We have an absolutely innate urge to make sense of the world, to eliminate ambiguity. If you think about that, that's equivalent really to data correction. So there's a black box system in our head. We're not aware of its operation. We can't control it. It hears a B. It sees an F. And it makes the decision, well, it's probably more likely that I've misheard than I've misseen. So as far as your perception goes, it just overwrites the B with an F. Completely. I once had to present this on a very wide stage where I had to go and stand completely to one side and I couldn't see the screen. And as it was going on, I suddenly started going, shit, it's not working. But you see these little whorls here? Those are exactly the same color. It's not alternating blue and green things, they're both green. But we detect color relative to other colors. Why? Because in evolutionary terms, it's a better thing to do. Contrast matters much more. It's not worth evolution planting a Pantone catalogue in our heads. What matters is the contrast between one color and another color. See the right, both of the whorls are that color of green. Now, the interesting thing about the sense-making drive, by the way, I'll give you a few interesting examples of that. One of which is, if you want a really successful example of 10x innovation, it's the electronic cigarette. More and more people actually continue using these things, and they switch to zero nicotine without really noticing it. In a weird kind of way, what the brain was addicted to wasn't so much the nicotine, it was addicted to the act of putting something hot in, hitting the trigeminal nerve at the back of the throat with something hot, breathing out, relax. Why? If you give regular drinkers a couple of gin and tonics, and then for the rest of the evening, you give them tonic water in a glass where the rim's been dipped in gin, just so they get the smell, okay? Not only will they not notice for the next 10 drinks, or 5 drinks, or whatever, they actually become pissed, okay? So they've only had 2 real gin and tonics, they've had 6 fake gin and tonics, which are 99.9% tonic water, plus the smell of gin. They act drunk. Okay? So what that is the brain effectively taking a shortcut. Every time I do this thing, I start talking bollocks and swaying around, so that's what I'm going to do now. If you want to use the McGurk effect in your real life to save money, don't buy a new car, have your existing car valeted. Right? Have you noticed this? When you have your car professionally cleaned, not only is it a cleaner car, it's smoother, quieter, it accelerates better, it corners more nicely. Everything about the car becomes better. And that's because actually our perception is very, very leaky. That's why when people sell their car, they always have it cleaned. Because if you tried to sell a dirty car, people would also think it was noisier, less pleasant to drive, everything else. By the way, that perception also applies to price. Has anybody here got an espresso machine? Okay, now, I've got one. Objectively, they are insanely expensive. If you had to buy Nespresso coffee in a jar like Nescafe, per equivalent dosage of caffeine, a jar of Nespresso would cost about £60. Or 60 euros. You'd look at it on the shelf and go, that's insane, I can buy Nescafe for only 5 or 6 euros. But it doesn't come in a jar. It comes in a little pod. So the frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it's a coffee shop. And you think, well, in the coffee shop I'd be paying £1.20. This little pod only cost me 28 cents. The machine's practically making me money. So our perception of things is relative. What the frame of reference is what you compare something to, matters much more than whether the thing is actually expensive or not. Here's another one, by the way. If you put up your hands, maybe put up 3 fingers so that you cover the join between the grey bit and the white bit, what you'll actually see is the top and bottom of that thing are exactly the same shade of grey. Again, it's just the brain effectively doing the work for you, going, the most likely thing that is a white thing and a grey thing. Cover the join, it's all grey. Take this next example. Whoop. Oh. If you hit spacebar. Perfect. That's a bit of a weird one. It's actually the same photograph rotated through 180 degrees. Most of you, I think, see the feet as sticking out on the left and indented normal footprints on the right. Is that right? Good. Now again, the brain has to make a decision here. It can't have them both indented or both sticking out. And the brain makes a decision which is, it's more likely that a source of light comes from above than from below. So it depicts that to you as though it's lit from above. If you look at that same picture, if I could turn the screen and make it flat, it might make it flat on the ground. It might look totally different. That again is your brain just making sense of stuff. Faces, we can't help seeing them. Okay? Now the interesting thing about that is, it's to our evolutionary advantage, because anything with two eyes and a nose and a bit of a face, it might be predator, it might be something we can eat, it might be another human being who's angry with us, it might be another human being who wants to sleep with us. Being able to spot faces and read them is really, really valuable in evolutionary terms. And the simple thing is that we're calibrated to be highly sensitive to that, so that as a result the brain generates quite a lot of false positives. It's like a smoke detector, if you think about it, okay? It's good that your smoke detector sometimes goes off when you make toast, because a false positive from a smoke detector isn't that big a problem, particularly not during the day when you're awake. What you don't want from a smoke detector is a false negative. You don't want a really chilled smoke detector that goes, hey, it smells a bit like burning, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt, right? So smoke detectors, when in doubt, they beep like hell. Our brain, when it might be a face, it says face. Now the interesting thing is, when you develop facial recognition software, they've discovered it has exactly the same bias as the human brain. If you want it to recognize faces reliably, it's always going to recognize faces when they aren't there. And that's a piece of facial recognition software that's suffering from what's called pareidolia, the human urge need to spot faces in rock formations, the man in the moon, the fact that we see faces in lots and lots of places where they don't exist. It's just a computational necessity. So here's my little bit of advice in a sentence. It's a bugger of a sentence, I grant you that. But what we need to do as marketers is look for things that are either objectively similar but subjectively different. In other words, something where you can take the same thing and make it 10 times cooler by presenting it in a different way. Or things which are subjectively similar but objectively different. In other words, how can I achieve the same effect as this expensive thing with a cheaper thing? Let me give you an example of someone who did that. Uber. If you've been running a cab company obsessed with objective measures 10 years ago, you would have measured lots of things like average number of cabs available, average waiting time, how long the typical passenger had to wait for a car to come. All objective stuff, okay? Uber, the principal valuable discovery of the man who founded Uber, not the slightly arsehole man who runs it now, but the nice Canadian chap who started the company, he saw a James Bond film where there was just a moving map in a car. And he thought, what if you had a cab firm that could map the arrival of your car? Now the magic, not all the magic, but a large part of the magic of Uber is that the human brain doesn't care that much about duration, it cares about certainty. Because I said we have this sense-making urge, the brain really, really hates uncertainty. There's some evidence that people are more unhappy if you say, there's a 50% chance you've got a serious disease, come back in 3 weeks' time and we'll do further tests. They'd actually be happier if you said, you've definitely got a serious disease. That's how much we really, really hate uncertainty. What Uber did was allow us to make stories about where our cab was. So we look at that and go, well, okay, oh look, he's stuck at those traffic lights. We are happier waiting 15 minutes for a train if we know it's 15 minutes than waiting 4 minutes for a train in a state of uncertainty. That's what I mean when I say, look for the things which are objectively similar but subjectively different, or vice versa. If you want a fantastic case of this, by the way, how many people have ever used customer service live chat? Instead of talking to a customer service agent on the phone, you basically, you're the kind of audience that would. The weird thing is, if you look at live chat objectively, it takes fucking ages, right? I mean, it's 4 times slower than a phone call. And yet, for psychological reasons I don't fully understand, no one minds. The reason, by the way, it's economic is that people are doing 3 or 4 people at once. The guy who's actually dealing with your query also has 4 other queries on the go. He also has the advantage of being able to use cut and paste quite a lot. You know, so I imagine if you're pretty experienced at doing this, you can actually be quite fast. What's strange about this is I had a thing with my daughter's mobile phone. It took an hour. But at no point did I even get mildly pissy about it. The single best thing the London Underground did to improve passenger satisfaction per pound spent wasn't faster, more frequent, more comfortable trains. It was dot matrix displays on the platform. Again, we're happy waiting 8 minutes if we know it's 8 minutes. The problem is, and I spoke to them about this, it's incredibly difficult for them to make the business case for installing these information systems because the business case is all predicated on objective reality, not subjective experience. Brilliant case of innovation, by the way, Spotify. People complained about the buffering time with the music, and they went to the engineers and they said, how low can you get it? And they came back a few weeks later and said, we've managed to get it to something like, I think it was it, I can't remember, 3,000 milliseconds. No, it must have been something like 220 milliseconds. And the guy said, can't you do any better than that? And they said, we could, but there's no point. Because to the human brain, 220 milliseconds is damn near the same as instantaneous. 250, not so good. We notice the delay. But there's a certain point, rather like the retina screen, at which we just don't notice. Making objective reality better than our ability to perceive it is a really dumb effort. So anyway, queuing. The psychology of queuing is a really extraordinary case, okay? Now, the objective measure is usually just the length of time someone spends in a queue. If you look at what upsets people about queues that keep moving keep people happier than queues that are occasionally stationary. If you really want to piss people off in a queue, you just have another queue alongside that's moving faster than their queue, okay? The weirdest thing about a queue, which I don't think anybody would actually know, is a large part of the emotional stress of being in a queue is created by the people behind you. McDonald's and KFC notice this. When you have a long queue, you'd think people would order perfectly because they've had, 8 minutes to rehearse the bloody menu. No, they fuck it up. They go bibbled, I don't know, bargain bucket, whatever. And the reason is people behind you, it's like stage fright. They stress you out. But virtually nobody, if you ask them about what the objective measures were that matter in queuing, would say, I don't like having any buggers behind me. Because ostensibly, the people behind you are completely irrelevant to your experience, but they're not. They weird you out. By the way, having the end of a queue out of sight also makes it a lot worse. This is the difference between the objective measure, which captures a very narrow thing, and the subjective experience, which is kind of multifaceted. Woo. Now, if you want the classic case, this is a 10x, by the way. How many of you, when you land on a plane and you don't go to the air bridge, but you get a bus, you're pissed off, aren't you, right? And you feel cheated. I've paid for this goddamn thing, and I've got a fucking bus, right? And you feel shortchanged, everything about it. I always felt like that. I used to get really pissed off. Shit, there's a bloody bus. And then one day, I land EasyJet at Gatwick, and the pilot, some sort of behavioral science genius by the look of things, he says, I've got bad news and good news. He said, the bad news is that we haven't been able to get an air bridge because there's a plane blocking our gate. But the good news is that the bus takes you right next to passport control so you don't have far to walk with your bags. Oh, shit. That's always true, okay? So here's a case where you can take something that's bad, redirect our attention to the good bit of it, and we now think it's good. Next time you're on a plane and there's a bus, just say quite loudly, it helps if you're with somebody else so you don't look mad, just say quite loudly, actually, I'm glad there's a bus because it drives us all the way to passport control and you don't have to carry your bags through the airport. And everybody within earshot will be made much, much happier just through hearing that. You can take something that's shit, frame it in a different way, redirect human attention to something different, and they think it's brilliant. If you don't believe me, apparently if you buy a Ferrari from new, they'll deliver the car to your local Ferrari garage for free. But they also offer you something else. You can pay 500 euros, have a tour of the factory in Maranello, and then take your car home. I don't know if you noticed this, right? By positioning it as a factory tour, they've got you to pay to collect your own bloody car, right? Something they normally have to do on a truck at their own expense. Those of you who know, it's Tom Sawyer painting the fence. Isn't it any Americans here? Yeah. He persuaded all his friends that it was a great privilege to paint the fence and reframed what was a tedious chore as something enjoyable. Now that's a 10x, whatever you think about it, okay? I think you can achieve 10x's with people's perception of paying tax if you just have a bit of an upside. The human brain is calibrated to look for the upside and to minimize regret by telling a positive story. The Fox and the Grapes is a classic example. That's 2,000 years old. If you can give people a bit of an upside, they'll accept change much more readily than if it's all downside. So one of my interesting challenges at the moment for innovation is you could get people on short train journeys to stand up on trains. How do you actually make people want to do it? If you can create a positive, like special standing booths which have tables, cup holders, and a plug, standing up might actually be reframed as a choice, not as a compromise. I don't know the answer to the question. By the way, we ask really weird questions like, why do people hate standing up on trains? Now that sounds stupid, but is it because they felt they paid for a seat and they're being cheated? Is it because it's uncomfortable standing up? Or is it actually because of something weirder, which is it takes a lot of cognitive effort not to fall over if you're standing up on a moving vehicle? Don't know, but if we could find that out, it's exactly like queuing. The real reason and the stated reason may be miles apart. So, very short summary of everything now. This is just the science of knowing what economists are wrong about. Because economists think that objective reality is perceived directly in the human brain as if we have an objective take on the world. And the simple fact is we don't. If you'd asked a bunch of rational people, right, we want to compete with Coca-Cola. How do we, 140 years, Coke's been the most popular cold non-alcoholic drink in the world apart from water. How do we compete? Everybody would say the same thing, right? We need a nicer tasting drink than Coke, that costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can, so everybody gets great value for money. No one can disagree with that, can they? Better tasting drink, costs less, really big can. And yet the most successful attempt to compete with Coke in 150 years is this. It comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting. I mean, it actually researched worse than any carbonated drink that's ever been researched by a company that only researches carbonated drinks. There's something about it, by the way, I think this is in the human brain, I think it's about related to the placebo effect, that if you want people to believe that a drink has medicinal powers, medicinal or psychotropic powers, it can't taste all that nice. Do you see what I mean? That actually medicines have to taste a bit yucky for us to believe that they're medicinal. You know, so I think there's something deep in psychology in this, which is why it actually works. So, first rule, don't always just test the obvious things. If your product isn't selling, don't just test dropping the price, test putting the price up. We've just had an experiment back in the UK, people who've refused to upgrade their broadband with 6 previous communications when they were offered to upgrade for free. Of those remaining people, 47% upgraded when you charged them 1p to upgrade. Okay? Seriously, adding 1 penny onto the price effectively tripled the successfulness of the communication. Don't quite know why that is, but as I said, don't just test what economics tells you to test, because all your competitors are doing that anyway. You won't find anything interesting. Test fucking weird Python-esque strange things, and when they succeed, you know something that nobody else does. That's what's really valuable in business. So anyway, few problems. Everybody in business always recommends logical things, not because they're necessarily better, but because it's much easier to get fired for being illogical than for being unimaginative. So everybody in business competes to be more logical than everyone else, which means that every business ends up in exactly the same place, which means the area of the market which is already most heavily contested. Very quickly, I'll just end on this because I've only got a few minutes left. Where complexity, economics, technology, and psychology overlap, you can achieve brilliant things. I'll end with one case, delayed prescriptions. This reduced the number of antibiotics unnecessarily prescribed by about 65%, just by saying to people, take this prescription away, you've got a bit of paper, your doctor's giving you that, it's dated till Friday, if you still feel ill on Friday, go and get antibiotics. Very simple thing if you think about most patterns of illness. You have, ooh, I feel shit, I'm feeling worse, I'm feeling worse, I'm feeling worse, God, I feel terrible, I'm beginning to feel a bit better, right? The second you get to the I'm beginning to feel a bit better, your appetite for taking drugs diminishes by about 90%. If you can get people to wait 3 days before they go and get the drugs, i.e. 3 days after the doctor's appointment, 66% of unnecessary use of antibiotics disappears. Very, very few. I've got 2 more minutes, is that right? 2 more tiny things. Okay. Trust. Economists think that all people are interested in is low prices. That's because economists assume a model of perfect trust and perfect information. I would argue that there's a very, very strong way to signal trust. If you look at game theory, okay, there are one-off games where it pays to defect, and there are repeated games where it pays to invest in a reputation by cooperating time after time after time. A reliable way to signal that you are trustworthy is to signal that you are in the game for the long term. How do you signal you're in the game for the long term? You do things which are costly up front and only pay off over time. So most marketing is often an example of signaling by, now, good manners, by the way, I include that in marketing, right? Can anybody, all instances I can think of being polite involve a bit more effort than being rude. Is that fair? Generally, you know, what politeness is dealing with people in a way that's nicer for them, but involves you in a bit more effort than if you're just a rude tosser. Opening a door for someone, standing up when someone comes into a room, all that kind of shit, right? It's always effortful. The fact that you do it suggests that you're playing the long game. Because if you weren't intending to interact with those people more than once, you wouldn't bother. Nearly all marketing, whether it's expensive advertising, whether it's replacing the furniture on your seats, we automatically trust people who do things that have an upfront cost and a long-term payoff. That's an engagement ring, by the way. That's also a form of marketing. Okay? If you're just planning on a one-night stand, there are cheaper alternatives, right? The only reason you're buying this is because you're planning to make this relationship pay in the longer term. All right? There's another particular reason why women like being given jewelry and flowers by men. Has anybody heard this? It's precisely because men aren't remotely interested in jewelry and flowers. Okay? So if you buy your wife flowers and a necklace for Christmas, you've made an actual sacrifice to make her happy. Whereas if you buy your wife a drone for Christmas, there's probably a strong suspicion of self-interest, if I'm being absolutely honest. Okay? Right, so this applies to marketing behavior. Economists hate it. Five Guys, the burger chain, which is growing throughout Europe everywhere, very, very expensive burgers, but they do some really odd things. When you order fries, you order a small cup of fries, they fill the whole cup up to the top. Then they take an extra scoop of fries and they just put it in the bottom of your bag for free as a bonus. Okay? Why do they do that? Because you'd only do that if you were thinking about them coming back. It's instantly a high trust thing because it suggests you're playing the long game, which is trustworthy and cooperative, not the short game, which is untrustworthy and psychopathic. So the one-off game, if you want a bad meal, go to a tourist restaurant. I mean, TripAdvisor's arguably killed that. But tourist restaurants had no expectation of anybody coming back, so they just had to serve a meal that was good enough to keep the person alive long enough to pay the bill. Okay? If you rely on a local clientele, you have to be nice to them. Because if they don't come back, you've got no business. That's the first little thing to know about costly signalling. Second thing is satisficing. And I'll end on this because it's quite important. Most real-life decisions aren't like archery. Aim for the 10. If you just miss, you get a 9. If you miss that, you get an 8. There's no optimal place to aim. Most real-life decisions are much more like darts. If you're not very good at darts, aim at the southwestern quadrant of the board. You won't get a triple 20, but you won't get a 1 or a 5. The average score is better. This is called satisficing. Now, why humans have evolved to satisfice is that if you make a decision with imperfect information, that's what nearly all human decisions are. We don't have, it's not like a maths problem. When we have to get married or decide what to eat or whatever, we don't have perfect information to make an optimal decision. Therefore, we're making a decision which is probabilistic. Whoop, okay. When you make a decision that's probabilistic, you have to consider two things. You have to consider the average outcome, but you also have to consider the variance. Got it? In other words, there's no point in climbing up a tree 100 feet to get 4 extra cherries if there's a 1% chance of death. Unless you're really, really hungry. Got it? So we don't optimize, we actually also adopt a Minimax strategy where we ask the question, what's the worst that can happen? And we often choose the option which has the lowest chance of catastrophe, not the one that has the highest average outcome. That is why, this is what the cat does, right? Watch this. Cucumber. If it might be a snake, treat it as if it's a snake, okay? Because the consequences of a false positive are embarrassment. The consequences of a false negative are death, okay? There probably were cats a million years ago who went, gosh, look at the lovely cucumber. Oh, shit, it's a snake. Those cats didn't leave many descendants. So we're disproportionately descended from people who, whatever their other faults, avoided making really, really shitty choices, at least until they'd reproduced, okay? Now, if you look at this, okay, that is the most successful restaurant in the world, not because it's the best restaurant in the world. It's a pretty low average, McDonald's, but it's a really low variance. McDonald's isn't very, very good as a restaurant. It's really, really good at not being terrible. Okay? You're never disappointed, you're never ripped off, you never get ill, right? You know, go to a Michelin-starred restaurant, one time in 5 you spend the afternoon on the bog. Okay? Go to McDonald's, you're safe. You're not going to be amazed, you're not going to be high-fiving anybody. It's not much good if you want to pull, but if you just want to eat, and you don't want to get ill, it's really good at not being awful. Now, why this is important is we discover things about satisficing. If you want men to buy cocktails in a bar, you will never sell a man a cocktail in a bar unless the menu contains a picture of the glass in which the drink is sold. Because if the male brain thinks there's a 0.1% chance it'll arrive looking like this, he'll order a beer instead, okay? Now, understand that that's why brands are popular, I would argue. This is contentious, okay? Once you understand that we care about variance, not only average, lots of human behaviors which appear irrational suddenly make perfect sense. That's why herd behavior. If you copy everybody else, the car you buy, if you buy the best-selling car, may not be the best car, it won't be terrible, okay? Habit. If you've done it 10 times before and it's always been okay, do it again, because it won't be terrible, okay? And that's the end. That's why brands work. People pay a premium for brands. David Ogilvy was onto this in 1960, and unfortunately it went nowhere. People pay a premium for brands not because they think brand B is better than brand A, but because they're more certain that it's good. It's less likely to be terrible. It's insurance against disappointment. Now, the reason I think this is important is when you look at the world negatively, and when you're also happy to test counterintuitive and apparently trivial things, that's when you discover a 10x. And that's probably my last slide. It is my last slide. Go and Google it, the $300 million button, okay? Something that should make virtually no difference at all to how likely people were to order something. I think it's from Best Buy. This was checkout as guest. If you allowed people to actually order their product and then click a button saying, add password, register me, okay? When you did that, But previously, they'd either had sign in or register. And you registered, and then you bought the product. When they added the additional option of buy the product anyway and register at the end, 97% of people offered the chance of registering at the end still registered at the end. They made $300 million extra sales, even though the amount of effort hadn't changed at all. All that had changed was the order in which people were doing it. Something about the human brain, typing in your name and address when it's to do with the delivery of your fridge feels reasonable. Typing in your name and address when it's framed as registration feels like a pain in the arse. Even though it's the same thing, it's objectively similar, but subjectively different. And that's where to look for 10Xs. Thank you very much indeed. And finally, there's that. Thank you. Oh, right, so yes, there we go. Oh, fantastic, thank you. Oh, space-age chairs. There we are. Marvelous. Oh.
So the guys are always pulling my leg that I over-exaggerate things. But from the standing ovation, you can tell for sure that I wasn't exaggerating this time. Before we start, you don't need to wait for me to say, are there any questions? Just raise your arm right now, keep it raised, and one of the girls will bring you the mic. This was a dynamite. Like 60 minutes full of wisdom, sound bites, and quote. Yeah, wisdom, believe me.
Part of what I'm saying actually is genuinely just feel free to test silly things. Because what happens is that people think, if you pretend that economists are right, you'll never get fired, okay? But equally, you'll never discover anything that interesting. So before you test dropping the price of something, try putting the price up. And if I've got time, I'll tell a story about this later. But there's extraordinary pressure on people in a business organization to look rational, okay? Because it makes them look serious, and it doesn't disturb anybody because you're following the model.
And that's what
you're basically. And a large part of it is just Red Bull. I mean, imagine under communism trying to make the case for Red Bull. Okay, what we really need, comrades, is an expensive, disgusting tasting drink in a tiny can. How do you make the case for it? And this is where actually really good business is like it's like Darwinian evolution more than it is like a planned economy. Because totally weird things succeed. I mean, we ought to admit that.
So out of all the sound bites and all the wisdom, the thing that struck me actually the most was the very first thing Rory said when he stepped out of this podium. Does anyone remember, including you? What did he say? It didn't have anything to do with his talk. No? It was, I was sitting in the crowd and listening to other speakers. That's exactly the same words J.B. Kasarjian said here in 2014. He was the closing speaker in 2014. That's not just what great speakers do. That's what great men do. Thank you for that.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We have our first question from the audience.
Hello. Hi. I would like to ask you, you're actually doing marketing stuff for clients, right?
Yes.
So, do you ever achieve to sell a story like this that clients actually do change their way of thinking? And I would just like to add one more thing to this Red Bull scenario, McDonald's scenario. These are all entrepreneurs which actually invented the whole different approach. So is it even possible to come into the company that is doing for years and years the same product, the same way to advertise it, and say, okay, I'm going to sell you something different, and they actually buy it and change their companies?
I think it's very interesting which is, you're absolutely right that the role of the entrepreneur, and this is sort of something that Hayek, as an economist, went on about a lot. There is that unique role of the entrepreneur in capitalism. And what makes the entrepreneur partly different, I think, is he doesn't have to explain himself to anybody else to quite the same extent. In other words, he's not part of a big structure. And if we're being absolutely honest, quite a lot of entrepreneurs are kind of weird. I mean, they might be psychopaths, they might be... Some entrepreneurs are actually really stupid, by the way. Okay? Now, the reason that is stupidity... Now, I'm quite friendly with Nassim Taleb, and one of the things he talks about is that one of the reasons capitalism works on a kind of larger scale level is it just rewards people who are lucky. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous. We hate that, don't we? Because we like to believe that all the people who make it big and make it rich deserved it. And they all tell the story that they deserved it. Sometimes you just come along, you open a restaurant in the right place at the right time. You couldn't have known what you were doing was good in advance. But when you're lucky, more money comes in. So the things that happen to be lucky survive. And the things that happen to be unlucky get weeded out. And it's totally unfair. Now, sometimes stupid people are actually differently lucky to intelligent people, because they do things that intelligent people wouldn't do. Now, when you do things that intelligent people wouldn't do, in fairness, you fail more often because you're doing something stupid. But when you do something stupid which happens to be really clever, because you're the only person doing it, you can succeed to an extraordinary extent. Now, when McDonald's came along, they were kind of... I mean, the McDonald brothers, it's complicated who's the entrepreneur there. Is it Ray Kroc or is it the original brothers? And they'd taken the kind of Detroit model of car manufacture and applied it to burgers. Now, what they're doing, and I think this is interesting, is that, and this same as Uber, okay? All taxi firms would have had certain metrics. And to some extent, Uber said, we're not going to bother particularly with those metrics. Low degree of uncertainty when waiting for a car, and also low degree of hassle getting out of the car. Because there's no paper changing hands, you don't need to ask for a receipt, you don't have to hand over cash, you just go thanks. And that probably makes it feel like a service, not a transaction. So I think, I think also with Uber, I think you feel a bit cool because you just walk out onto the pavement just as the car draws up, which makes you feel a bit like Louis XIV, But I think, the interesting thing is the metrics that Uber's really good at are different. And with McDonald's, every single American diner when McDonald's started would have assumed that a huge degree of choice. I don't know how familiar you are with American diner culture, but it was all about eggs over easy, eggs sunny side up, peel one off the wall, which means something. Does anybody remember? Lettuce, I think it might mean. But there are like hundreds of phrases for how you customized your meal in American diners. And McDonald's came along and basically said, no, you can't have any choice, but you can have it really fast. And so one of the reasons why kind of stupid or pig-headed people do well when they do well, they do really well, is because they're ignoring all the category norms which everybody else thinks are important, and just emphasizing something completely different. Now, there's a weird property about the human brain which is worth knowing. Have you heard of Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow? Now, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics for prospect theory, which is a thing about human expectation and decision-making. But when someone asked him, what's the most important lesson of your life's work, he didn't mention the thing that won him a Nobel Prize. He said this, he said, nothing is as important as you think it is while you are thinking about it. Okay? Now, the interesting thing there is, my story about EasyJet, read a good book, Robert Cialdini's book, Persuasion, by the way, if you want a good book recommendation. One of the things entrepreneurs do is that if you go to an American diner, you think it's all about choice, because the emphasis, the menu, it's all about choice, so choice is important. If you suddenly went to a new McDonald's, it was all about speed, and you were encouraged to focus on speed, so speed became salient, and where our attention lies, that's what we think is important. So with that EasyJet pilot, when he said, you won't have far to walk to the gate because the bus will take you all the way there, he changed our focus from we don't get a bloody gate to avoid a walk, and suddenly what was bad became good because we were looking at something else. And I mean, if you look at it in a weird way, I suppose really cool boutique hotels do this. You often, it's not really about, if you take the old-fashioned, five-star hotel of the 1970s, it was all about opulence. And then as fashions change, as tastes change, but also just by changing people's focus, what you do is you don't do any of the opulent shit, but you put an espresso machine in the room or something,
Sorry, this is not a discussion.
Sorry.
You had one question, no
Oh,
follow-ups.
I'm sorry. We can meet afterwards, I'm sure, yeah.
there was another question.
Hi.
Whoa!
Whoops, wasn't working. Hi, Rory. As you said in your lecture, the important thing when you want to try to change things, if you cannot change those things physically, you can change their perception. And if you're an entrepreneur, like the McDonald's brothers, you're affecting people who are your customers. But if you work in a corporation and you need to get the management buy-in for the decision and for the audacity to try something new, what is, in your practice and in your opinion, a better way to approach this? Is it better to present them with the rationale arguments, like the examples that you shown them today to us, or is it better to play on their emotions and to get the buy-in that you need?
Very thanks. Also, there's an important question to ask, which what I talked about when I talked about satisficing, it's sometimes called in corporations defensive decision making, where we make the decision, not that's the best decision, but the one where we're least likely to get fired for it. You know the famous line, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. Now, so there are actually two questions there. What's the best thing to do which is good for your career, and what's the best decision to make? And they're not actually the same. I'll give you an example of this. When you have penalty shootouts to decide even major things like a World Cup final, okay, the individual players should kick straight down the middle more than they do. They'd be more likely to score, not all of them obviously, but if one or two of them just shot the ball straight down the middle, they'd be more likely to score. And that's because goalkeepers tend to dive because they don't want to look useless. The reason the people don't kick down the middle is not because you're less likely to score, you're more likely to score slightly. You look much stupider if you fail. If you kick left and the goalkeeper goes left, you're unlucky. Kick right and the goalkeeper goes right, you're unlucky. Kick down the middle, you're more likely to score, but if the goalkeeper happens to stay in the middle and save, you look useless, right? So there's an interesting question about how you give people permission to be a bit weird in a business. So one of the things to do, if you have someone, someone who reports to you, go and say to them, I'll just make the parallel, okay? If you're the manager of that football team, your job is to shoulder the blame. And what you should do before there are penalties is you should say, player 1 and player 4, I want you to kick the ball straight down the middle. Now, if you fail, you can say that I told you to do that, okay? You got that? Now they're more likely to do it because they can say, I didn't want to kick it down the middle, bloody manager made me do it, okay? Similarly, as a boss, maybe what you should often say is, I want you to come back with 3 or 4 possible things to do here, and I want one of them to be weird. Does that make sense? Because then, if you choose the weird one, so there's a very, very strong bias in an organization to pretend, no one ever got fired for pretending that economics is true. So, if you go, we aren't selling this product, so I think we should drop the price, okay? If you do that and it fails, you'll never get fired because you've obeyed the logic of economics. If you say, let's try putting the price up, well, okay, you might succeed and make even more money because you'll sell more at a higher price. If you succeed, you'll get a few brownie points. But if it fails, you now look stupid because you were like doubly wrong. And so one of the important things I think is permission for people to test counterintuitive things, because the default is always to go and test what makes sense. So, I'll give you a lovely example of this. What I find fascinating about this whole area is advertising is a bit like the Galapagos Islands of understanding human behavior. You get lots and lots of peculiarities. You can apply what you find in a really trivial way, but you can take the same finding and apply it to something really big. So I'll give you an example where people are conventionally rational. Everybody who's producing drugs, who works for a pharmaceutical company, thinks, let's make these drugs really easy to take. So we'll make them as small as possible, really easy to swallow, okay? And that's not a totally bad thing, but they assume that's what everybody's trying to do. Actually, if you have a drug that someone has to take every day, it's probably better to make the drug a bit awkward to take, so you create a ritual around it, so you've got to grind it up in a pestle, then dissolve it in water, because then people can't forget. Because if they've done it for a week before they go to bed, they'll notice not doing it. Whereas swallowing 3 pills, which are microscopically small, something you can forget whether you've even done it or not, okay? But the easy logical one is, let's produce a nicer tasting drink than Coke is really easy to sell to an institution. The counterintuitive answer always requires a more complicated argument and makes you look much worse if you fail. And so if you can create some sort of culture at least around you as far as you have the power. Now, one really important thing to say is this, okay? Testing shit in the digital world is easier and you can cut off failure faster than you could in the real world. So one argument you can make to your boss is, look, if this were print, if we were actually printing invitations to this event, we go with the default logical thing of save 20%, right? But because this is digital, for the first week, let's throw out 10% of them at a higher price. Okay? This may be unethical. But what I'm saying is, in a digital world, the cost of being wrong about the slightly illogical is much, much lower because A, it costs less to do in the first place, and B, if it doesn't work, you can find out and kill it vastly faster than you could do in a world of, say, in the physical world. So one logical argument you can make is actually the returns to weirdness are higher in a digital world, therefore we should be weirder. And one of the strange things that's baffled me is that, in the digital world, the payoff for bravery is higher and the downside is more contained, by and large. And yet, strangely, businesses have become more cowardly rather than less over the last 10 years. Does that make sense?
One last question over there. So actually, that's the first guy in the whole wide world who texted me when we announced you as our keynote speaker.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both, first Rory, for coming on this stage, and Vlad, Vanya, to make it happen. I just wanted, you mentioned a lot of McDonald's, and I would love to ask you your point of view on the trend that so many leading brands are developing a vast range of sub-products, different tastes. Now you have one brand put on the shelf with, 20 tastes, 20 different colors. From McDonald's, from one burger with cheese and Coke, now we have, 200 products in the offer. And how do you see that from the market point of view and from marketing point of view?
It's complicated because in defense, one of the reasons you do that is simply, it depends which field you're in, but one of the reasons you do that is simply to get shelf facings. Because consumers tend to think that the brand there's more of on the shelf is more popular, and because of the herd instinct I mentioned. So in one case, it paid very heavily. So Walker's, which is the Frito-Lay crisp brand in the UK, they discovered that more and more crisps were being bought in big supermarkets in multi-packs. And they introduced a load of new flavors. Now, if you look at British, this is going to sound really weird, because I know every country is very different in the way it consumes crisps, or chips, as the Americans call them, okay? So, funnily enough, Spain and Britain are very similar. But then if you go to Italy, it'll be completely different. But basically, 90% of Britons buy salt and vinegar, ready salted, or cheese and onion, okay? And all the prawn cocktail then is about 8%, and all the other weird flavors are really, really niche. But the reason they added them was simply that it made them look much, much bigger than their competitor on the supermarket shelves, even though they didn't. The shelf life's fairly long as well. So in some cases, the rationale is quite good. In other cases, it dilutes what seemed to be the positioning of the brand. And it can it also be really careful because it can mess with the choice architecture really, really badly. So, the weird thing about the choice architecture, a very strong human propensity is if you have 3 things, people default to the one in the middle. And so now there are really clever things you can do, okay, with this. When P&G, it's called the Goldilocks effect because of Goldilocks and this one's just right. the one in the middle. When P&G launched Pampers, before they launched Pampers, the perception of disposable diapers was that they were really expensive. What P&G did is they launched a really, really expensive brand of diapers, disposable diapers, and they advertised it. They always intended to kill it, okay? But they did it so that when Pampers came in, they were half the price of the other brand, so they seemed cheap. Okay? I've been told, how many people here are slightly pervy about their dishwasher? Finish, do you have Finish here? Reckitt Benckiser. They launched Finish Quantum, which is the most expensive. Did anybody else always buy the most expensive dishwasher thing? There's a slightly pervy thing. Yeah, I know. It's a blokey thing, isn't it? It's weird. But there we go, okay? They launched this super expensive thing called Quantum immediately after the 2008 financial crisis. Because they realized if you had one thing that cost 16 euros for sort of 40, some people will buy it, and they probably make money out of it. But what it's really there for is to make the rest of the dishwasher powders seem a lot cheaper than the Quantum. It exploits that comparative perception effect. So, I mean, but what you're saying is really interesting. Sometimes what it can do is completely mess up. So if you're sitting in the sweet spot of the market, just right in the middle, and you introduce variants like light and super light, what you can end up doing is knocking your main brand out of that sweet bit in the middle. And that can be really damaging. But it's hugely complicated. I'll give you the biggest example of all, by the way. If you combine the McGurk effect, which is we perceive not just objective reality, we perceive lots of other things as well. When we founded Ogilvy Change, one of our first clients came to us from a large biscuit manufacturer in continental Europe, and they said, we don't understand it because we introduced this new low-fat variant of our biscuit, and it was 20% lower fat, but nobody in blind tasting could tell the difference in taste. And now we've launched it, sales are down like 25%, it's a catastrophe. And we said to them, you didn't put now lower fat on the packaging, did you? And they said, well, of course we did. Why would we spend a fortune reducing the fat of our biscuits and not tell people? I said, because if you put low fat on the packaging, they'll taste shit. By the way, I'm not making this up, okay? If you just make a health claim, if you put kind to the environment on washing powder, people will think it's less effective. Really sorry, but it's true, okay? So the way to do it, by the way, this is really interesting. If you want people to buy concentrates, one of the problems with concentrates is that when we put less in, we think it's doing less of a good job. So the trick is have less in volume, which is kind to the environment, but make up for it with complexity. So if you have flecks in washing powder, little coloured flecks, we think it's more effective because it's got two things in it rather than one. And then if you look at the man who likes the Finish Quantum, that's got three different things arranged around a power ball in the middle. And because it's complicated, we think it's really good. Okay? Now, with the biscuit thing, what they should have done if they wanted to improve the health of people in the country, what they should have done is just reduce the fat content and not told anybody. Because if you put now with lower fat on, it won't taste as good. The human brain, this sense-making urge, looks for trade-offs. And if you're told that something's now healthier, we'll just assume it doesn't taste as nice, and therefore it won't taste as nice. I know it's really weird, you see what I mean? But when they researched the taste, they just said, what do you think of the taste of this? It was blind. Now, one of the dumb things which drove me crazy, which I noticed they backed up on, is, did you notice that Coke, possibly to save money, had started making the lids of, do you have Diet Coke or Coke Light here? The lids always used to be white or silver, whereas standard Coke had a red lid. And possibly to save money, they started putting a red lid on Coke Light. And I just said to them immediately, I said, you're insane. I said, this will ruin the taste of Diet Coke. I mean, seriously, okay? Because you've been there for 10 years going, no, I like the one with the silver lid. Put a red lid on it, the taste's changed. We'll think it's high calorie. All sorts of shit will happen. Now, interestingly, I noticed they've gone back to silver. Have you noticed that? Now, my hunch is that sales dropped off by some 10 or 15%. Now, I know that's really weird, but the fact is that the brain is the product of evolution, and it has all these heuristics and tricks. And one of the strange things is we conflate taste with sight. We conflate taste with smell. because generally that's more efficient for data processing purposes, and that's what helped keep us alive.
This was awesome. In order to conclude this, I will paraphrase you. So you said, if you don't have trust, you aren't going to sell.
Yeah, absolutely true, yeah.
Thank you, and thank all
Thank
of
you very much for inviting
putting
me.
your trust in
Thank
us.
you. Thank you. Pleasure. Yeah.